We begin with a debate on affirmative action. Author Dinesh D'Souza and law professor Frank Wu took part in this forum last month at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Mr. D'Souza is the author of 3 books, including The End of Racism and a recent biography of Ronald Reagan. Mr. Wu teaches in the Clinical Law Center Elder Law Program at Howard University in Washington, D.C.
Let's begin. We have 2 extremely gifted and intelligent speakers. I myself have seen them in action before, and as you will see, each of them is a person of remarkable character. Professor Frank Wu did his undergraduate work at Johns Hopkins and received a law degree from the University of Michigan. He has taught at Stanford University Law School and is now teaching at Howard University School of Law. His academic articles in law journals include Neither Black Nor White, Asian Americans in Affirmative Action, and The Limits of Borders, a moderate proposal for immigration reform. Professor Wu has testified against legislation that would abolish affirmative action and federal government contracting. He writes on a regular basis for the New York Times Syndicate and Asian Week. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and World Journal. Professor Wu. Dinesh D'Souza graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Dartmouth College. He has been a senior domestic policy analyst in the White House during the Reagan administration. Mr. D'Souza is a John M. Olin Foundation Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He doesn't like Washington, but he lives there. He said not to like Washington. Mr. D'Souza's book, Ronald Reagan, How an Ordinary Man Became an Extraordinary Leader, will be published by the Free Press in November of '97. I have a copy here. He told me that the photograph on the cover looks like John Wayne, which in some ways is a theme of the book. I think he's right, for better or worse. Mr. D'Souza has been featured. Mr. D'Souza is the author also of a New York Times bestseller called Illiberal Education, The Politics of Race and Sex on Campus, and also another book called The End of Racism. Mr. D'Souza has been featured on numerous programs, including This Week with David Brinkley, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, Nightline, Crossfire, Firing Line, and Good Morning America. Mr. D'Souza. This is our format for this evening. I shall introduce each speaker in turn. First, Mr. D'Souza will speak for 15 minutes. Then, Professor Wu will speak for 15 minutes. Mr. D'Souza will then reply for 5, and Professor Wu will reply for 5. At that point, the debate begins, and I'll be asking you and inviting you to ask questions At the end, I'll invite each of the speakers to give us some closing remarks. Without further ado, Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see this is a wide podium. I guess I didn't have to wear pants. I was very touched to see the protesters outside. I'm delighted to be at Brown. What is Brown University without a few protesters? And I think people watching this show on C-SPAN will be delighted to hear that there are still international socialists around somewhere. I know those guys have been in a somewhat irritable mood ever since the Berlin Wall fell. I must tell you that, as you know, the subject of my new book is Reagan, and when Reagan was governor in the 60s, a very tumultuous time in California. There were protests at Berkeley, San Francisco State, and Reagan was constantly accosted by activists who would try to shout at him, blockade him, surround his limousine. And in the 60s, in the late 60s, he was once traveling in his limousine. A group of protesters surrounded the limousine, and they held up signs saying, "We are the future." And Reagan kind of looked at this and scribbled his own reply on a piece of paper and held it up, and it said, "I'll sell my bonds." Now, I'm here to talk about the very difficult or the very challenging topic of race. Affirmative action sometimes involves both race and gender, but I'm going to focus my remarks on the debate surrounding race, partly for a reason stated some years ago by, of all people, Gerald Ford. He said there will never be a war between the sexes because there has simply been too much fraternizing with the enemy. Gender is a serious issue, but it doesn't, it seems to me, have the same prospects for social balkanization or social division as does race. Now, we are at a critical turning point in the affirmative action debate. We see that in California, at the University of California at Berkeley, at the University of Texas Law School. We are seeing that the imposition of colorblind laws, of laws requiring a colorblind admissions policy, are leading to a quite dramatic decline in the number of black and Hispanic students. And many of the defenders of affirmative action, in a sense having run out of other arguments, are now saying, look at this result. Look at the diminution of the percentage of blacks and Hispanics at Berkeley. Are you willing to live with these outcomes? And what I want to do today in my opening statement is make the case for why we should answer to that question a reluctant yes. The debate surrounding affirmative action hinges crucially on what affirmative action is and how it works or doesn't work. Recently at the University of California at Berkeley, I approached the director of admissions and posed to him this question. I said, imagine the case of a student applying to this fine university who has a grade average in high school of B+ to A- and an SAT score of about 1,200 out of 1,600. In other words, a good student. And I said, if this student happens to be, let us say, Hispanic, what is the probability that he or she would be admitted to Berkeley? And he replied, the probability would be 100%. Student would be guaranteed admission. And I said, fine. Now imagine the case of a student who has the same grades, the same test scores, and the same extracurricular talent. But like me, the student is of Asian descent. What would be the odds that this same student would be offered admission to Berkeley? And he said the chance of that would be approximately 5%. In other words, what Berkeley has been doing, and many universities, including Brown, is practicing aggressive forms of racial preference in its admissions policy. Now, if you were to approach the admissions director at Brown and ask him, why are you doing this? Why do you have preferential policies that judge people not on the content of their character, not on their academic preparation, but primarily or decisively on their race? he would probably reply, or she would probably reply, that's because America has a long history of discrimination, a history that continues to this very day, and a history that I will admit is undeniable. And affirmative action is necessary at Brown to fight discrimination. And then you may ask the following question. If that is true, if students applying to Brown are facing discrimination, where is that discrimination? Are there racists in the admissions office at Brown who are trying to keep Hispanics and blacks out? Are you, sir, you can ask the admissions director, a racist yourself? Are you the problem? And the answer is no. No one even alleges this. No one claims that there are bigots in the Berkeley admissions office or in the Texas admissions office. So what then is the problem? Let me suggest that what the problem is that at Brown, at Berkeley, many other universities, equality of rights for individuals is not leading to equality of results for groups. In other words, what we are now seeing is that merit is creating some of the same inequality that racism used to create. And this is convincing many advocates of affirmative action that merit itself is a racist concept. And that's why, for example, you now have all these schools saying, well, maybe we should get rid of the tests. Maybe we should eliminate the standardized tests. Not because of any inherent defect in the test, but because the test is not giving us a result that we want. Now, let us say that what Berkeley and Brown and many universities are trying to do is to have a racially preferential policy to have a diverse student body. It nevertheless remains true that these policies have certain undeniable effects, and I would like to focus briefly on two. The first effect is what I will call the racial effect, and that is that these policies tend to intensify and exacerbate racial consciousness and racial intoxication in our society. A generation after Martin Luther King's death, we are an ever more racialized society. Very difficult to go through life without checking little boxes all the time on which you are asked to specify your race and in which your race will make a decisive difference. And the question is, do you want to continue to live in that kind of society? Now, I concede that when affirmative action policies were first established in the 60s, in the late 60s, many Americans supported them because they felt that something needed to be done to kick in the door of the old segregation. Something needed to be done specifically for blacks, because blacks had suffered a history of slavery, of segregation. And so affirmative action was intended for blacks. And what happened a little bit later is many other groups showed up at the multicultural picnic. And they said, you had the Hispanic groups, you had the gay rights groups, the women's groups, and they basically said, we too are victims of discrimination. We demand preferential treatment too. And if you look at the history, you will see that the black leaders in the 60s at first said, forget it. Can you advance a comparable claim of historical discrimination compared to ours? No. But then a second thought dawned to them. And this thought was this: even though the admission of these other groups onto the affirmative action bandwagon might weaken the moral case for affirmative action, it will strengthen the political coalition that will keep these programs going indefinitely, if not forever. In other words, as long as it was just blacks, blacks were reliant on white goodwill to keep these programs going. But if you allow women, gays, other groups to come in, then perhaps you can knit together a 51% coalition. And the effect of this, the consequence of this, has been to strengthen the political support for affirmative action, but I think fatally to weaken its moral foundation. And so we now are at a situation where the son or daughter of Jesse Jackson, who went to private school in the Washington, D.C. area, would get preference to get into Brown over the son of a white postman. We now have it the case that immigrants from Barbados or Bombay qualify for certain jobs or government contracts denied to native-born whites. Now, can any reasonable person defend these forms of bias, these forms of preference? Justice Blackmun said in the Bakke case that in order to make people equal, we have to treat them differently. In order to get beyond race, we've got to take race into account. This, it seems to me, is a central contradiction surrounding affirmative action. Now, I mentioned earlier that the problem is not so much discrimination today as merit. And let me put it this way. It is now the case that on virtually every measure of academic achievement or economic performance, you think of a measure. Think of a test in any subject and administer it to 100 randomly selected whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in the United States today, in any part of the country at any age. And I will tell you in advance the result. Asians and whites will do the best, Hispanics will fall in the middle, African Americans will do the least well. I said on virtually every measure. And I assure you that in the national debate surrounding this issue, I have not found, no one has been able to give me one counterexample to this pattern. And my point is, merit is creating inequality. Let me give you one statistic that you should think about and think hard about. And that's this. On the SAT, which most of you, if not all of you, have taken, on the Scholastic Assessment Test, verbal and math section both, Asians and whites who come from families making less than $15,000 a year score higher on the test every year than African Americans who come from families earning over $60,000 a year. Now think about that, because if you're going to sit around and tell me the test merely measures socioeconomic privilege, how do you account for that result? If you're going to tell me that the test measures racism, I say to you that perhaps the verbal section of the test may be biased. It measures synonyms and antonyms, and that depends on where you grew up, perhaps. Forget it. Throw out the verbal section of the test. Ignore it. Focus only on the math section. Can anyone tell me with a straight face that equations are racially biased? And if not, if the math section of the test is manifestly not biased, why are poor whites and Asians doing better on math tests than upper middle class blacks? This is the heart of the American dilemma, and it is the fact that the advocates of affirmative action are in denial about. That merit creates inequality, and it is merit that has now come under assault. Now, why does merit create inequality? I'm not arguing for a minute, and in fact in my book I argue against the notion that there is some kind of natural or biological or genetic factor involved. No. What I am arguing is that there are, if you will, cultural or behavioral differences between groups. These differences are observable in everyday life. They are measurable by the techniques of social science. They can be directly correlated with academic achievement and economic performance. I'll give you one example. A professor at Stanford named Dornbush was very puzzled about an assertion in the bell curve that Asian American students are doing better in California because perhaps they are naturally better at math. And so what he did is a comparative study looking at students from different ethnic groups. And he concluded that there is a very counterintuitive reason for why Asian Americans do better. And that is that Asian Americans study harder. On average, he found Asian American students in high school spend about 12 hours a week studying, compared to about 7 or 8 hours for white students and even less for Hispanic and black students. My point is, if this is true, let's pause it for a moment, it's true. You might ask me why. Why do Asian American students study harder? I don't know entirely, but I can suggest one factor, and that would be family structure. On average, it is probably true that in a two-parent family, you have more attention, more time to impose discipline, make your young kids study, than in a single-parent family. This would seem to be obvious. What is the illegitimacy rate in the Asian American community? 2 to 3%. What about in the African American community? 70%. These are huge, huge differences. And my point is, once we begin to concede the truth of this, we then begin to get to what can be best done about it. And what can be best done about it is to basically say, how can we tackle the problems of terrible public schools, of lousy neighborhoods, of graffiti on the walls, of broken families, of gangs? These factors are leading to different levels of preparation for students who apply to Brown. Affirmative action is a very cosmetic, it's a non-solution. It basically says we're going to solve the problem of different levels of academic preparation by having a race in which we draw a straight line and ask Fred, you start 10 yards ahead. Jane, you start 3 yards behind. Is that a fair race? No, it's a race that's been rigged. Now, so I'll be happy later on to talk about solutions, of which I have quite a few. But let me conclude on this note. Many years ago, Martin Luther King said, and I'm not going to quote the line that you're thinking of about the content of our character. Martin Luther King said, every man ultimately must write with his own hand the charter of his Emancipation Proclamation. And what he meant by this is that in a free society, we have the right to ask, we have the right to demand that the government give us equality of rights under the law. But we do not have the right to demand any more than that. What we do with those rights, what we make of our destiny, the script we write of our lives, that ultimately is up to us. Thank you.